In the narrow, working-class streets of South Boston during the 1930s, a neighborhood carved from Irish immigrant dreams and economic desperation, James Joseph Bulger Jr. entered a world where survival often meant bending the rules. Born on September 3, 1929, into a family struggling against the harsh realities of the Great Depression, young James would inherit more than just his father's name. He would absorb the complex moral landscape of a community where loyalty to family and neighborhood often superseded loyalty to law. The South Boston of James's childhood was a place frozen in time, yet constantly evolving under the pressures of economic hardship and social change. The neighborhood, known locally as Southie, represented one of the most insular Irish-American enclaves in the United States. Streets lined with triple-decker houses told the story of generations of immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunity, only to find themselves confined to a small peninsula separated from the rest of Boston by geography and increasingly by choice. The residents of South Boston had learned to depend on each other, creating an intricate network of mutual assistance that operated entirely outside official channels. The Bulger family occupied a modest apartment on Logan Way, a street that perfectly encapsulated the neighborhood's character. James Bulger Sr., the family patriarch, embodied the working-class Irish-American ideal of his generation. Standing just over 5 feet tall but possessing the kind of wiry strength that comes from decades of manual labor, he worked as a longshoreman on the Boston waterfront when work was available, supplementing his income with whatever odd jobs he could find during the lean periods that seemed to stretch longer each year. His hands, permanently stained and calloused from handling cargo and machinery, told the story of a man who understood that survival required constant effort and unwavering determination. John Bulger, James's mother, managed the household with the kind of stern efficiency that Irish mothers had perfected over generations of raising children in circumstances where every penny mattered and every decision had consequences. She attended daily mass at St. Monica's Church, the spiritual center of the neighborhood, where she prayed for her family's prosperity and her children's moral guidance with the fervent dedication of someone who understood that faith might be the only reliable constant in an uncertain world. The church, with its soaring spires and stained glass windows depicting scenes of suffering and redemption, provided not just spiritual guidance, but served as the unofficial community center where information was exchanged, alliances were formed, and the complex social hierarchies that governed neighborhood life were constantly negotiated and maintained. The young James displayed characteristics that would define his entire life from an early age. Teachers at the local elementary school noted his exceptional intelligence and remarkable memory, but also observed a troubling tendency toward manipulation and an apparent inability to accept authority that he considered illegitimate or hypocritical. Report cards from this period describe a student capable of academic excellence who seemed more interested in studying the behavior and motivations of his classmates than in mastering traditional subjects. Even as a child, James possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed him to identify weaknesses and exploit them with a sophistication that unsettled adults who encountered him. His physical appearance contributed to his emerging reputation within the neighborhood. The platinum blonde hair that would later earn him the nickname Whitey was unusual among the predominantly dark-haired Irish population of South Boston, making him instantly recognizable and somehow set apart from his peers. This distinctive appearance, combined with his piercing blue eyes and an early growth spurt that left him taller and more physically imposing than most boys his age, created an aura of difference that he learned to cultivate and use to his advantage. The economic pressures of the Great Depression affected every family in South Boston, but they seemed to impact the Bulger household with particular severity. James Sr.'s work on the waterfront became increasingly sporadic as shipping traffic declined and competition for available jobs intensified. The family often struggled to meet basic expenses, and young James became acutely aware of the contrast between their circumstances and those of families in other parts of Boston who seemed immune to the economic hardships that dominated his daily reality. This awareness fostered a resentment toward legitimate authority and conventional society that would only deepen over time. The streets of South Boston provided an alternative education that complemented and eventually superseded anything James learned in school. The neighborhood's isolation had created a unique culture where traditional rules were viewed with suspicion and where success was often measured by one's ability to outsmart the system rather than work within it. Local legends spoke of men who had made fortunes through clever schemes that skirted the edges of legality, and these stories provided inspiration for ambitious young men who saw few other paths to prosperity and respect. By his early teenage years, James had begun associating with a group of neighborhood youths who shared his skepticism toward conventional authority and his appetite for risk-taking. These early associates, drawn from families facing similar economic pressures, included individuals who would remain part of his criminal network for decades to come. The bonds formed during late-night gatherings in abandoned buildings and clandestine meetings in neighborhood basements created relationships based on mutual trust and shared secrets that would prove more enduring than family ties or legitimate friendships. The progression from minor mischief to serious criminal activity followed a predictable pattern that reflected both James's growing confidence and his increasing isolation from conventional society. Initial activities focused on petty theft from local businesses, usually targeting establishments whose owners were viewed as outsiders or whose success seemed to come at the expense of the broader community. These early crimes served multiple purposes. They provided immediate financial benefits during periods of particular hardship. They demonstrated courage and resourcefulness to peer groups whose approval mattered more than adult disapproval. And they offered opportunities to test and refine methods that would later be applied to more ambitious undertakings. The shoplifting that occupied much of James's early criminal career required careful observation of target establishments, detailed planning of entry and exit strategies, and coordination between multiple participants who had to trust each other completely to avoid detection and prosecution. These experiences provided crucial training in operational security, risk assessment, and team management that would prove invaluable in later criminal enterprises. More importantly, they demonstrated that conventional authority figures, store owners, security guards, police officers, could be outwitted by individuals willing to invest sufficient time and effort in understanding their methods and limitations. Street fighting, which served as both entertainment and education for South Boston's youth, provided James with advanced training in the psychology and mechanics of violence. These encounters, usually triggered by territorial disputes or perceived slights that demanded immediate response, taught important lessons about the strategic use of force as a tool of persuasion rather than simply an expression of anger or frustration. James quickly learned that the most effective violence was often the least dramatic, that a carefully calculated display of force could achieve results that would require much more extensive actual violence to accomplish. The local gang structures that dominated South Boston's youth culture provided James with his first exposure to criminal organization and hierarchy. These groups, while nominally focused on neighborhood defense and social activities, served as training grounds for more serious criminal enterprises. Leadership positions within these gangs were earned through demonstrated competence in planning and executing increasingly sophisticated criminal schemes, and James quickly established himself as someone capable of both strategic thinking and tactical execution. His first significant encounter with law enforcement came in 1943, when he was arrested for larceny at the age of 14. The charge, while relatively minor, represented a crucial turning point that forced him to confront the reality that his criminal activities carried genuine risks and consequences. The experience of being processed through the juvenile justice system, fingerprinted, photographed, questioned, and confined, provided valuable intelligence about law enforcement methods and procedures that would inform his approach to criminal activity for the rest of his life. The arrest also served as an introduction to the complex relationship between South Boston's criminal community and the broader Boston Police Department. James quickly learned that law enforcement in his neighborhood operated according to informal rules that often had little relationship to official procedures. Personal relationships, family connections, and neighborhood loyalties frequently influenced how cases were investigated and prosecuted, creating opportunities for those smart enough to understand and exploit these informal systems. During his mid-teenage years, James began demonstrating the leadership qualities and strategic thinking that would later make him one of New England's most powerful criminal figures. Rather than simply participating in criminal activities organized by others, he started initiating his own schemes and recruiting participants from among his neighborhood associates. These early leadership experiences taught him crucial lessons about delegation, risk management, and the importance of maintaining strict operational security within criminal organizations. The bank robbery activities that would eventually lead to his first major conviction began as carefully planned exercises in tactical execution and psychological warfare. James approached these crimes with the kind of systematic preparation that characterized military operations, conducting detailed surveillance of target institutions, studying the routines of employees and security personnel, and developing multiple contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop during actual operations. This methodical approach reflected both his natural intelligence and his growing understanding that successful criminal enterprises required the same kind of professional competence that characterized legitimate businesses. The series of bank robberies that culminated in his 1956 arrest demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that impressed even the federal agents responsible for investigating them. Court records from the time described crimes that involved extensive advance preparation, careful coordination between multiple participants, and creative approaches to traditional security measures that suggested considerable study of banking procedures and law enforcement response protocols. These operations also demonstrated James's ability to maintain discipline and loyalty among criminal associates under the intense pressure that accompanied high-stakes criminal activity. His conviction and sentencing to federal prison in 1956 marked the end of his apprenticeship period and the beginning of a transformative experience that would fundamentally shape his approach to criminal enterprise. The federal prison system of the 1950s was a harsh and unforgiving environment where survival required quick adaptation to complex social hierarchies and unwritten rules that governed every aspect of inmate life. James entered this system as a relatively inexperienced criminal and emerged nearly a decade later as someone who possessed sophisticated knowledge of criminal methodology, organizational structure, and the strategic applications of both violence and cooperation. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where James served most of his sentence, housed some of the most accomplished criminals in the United States. This concentration of criminal expertise created an informal university where inmates could learn advanced techniques in various criminal specialties while also studying the mistakes that had led to their capture and conviction. James approached this educational opportunity with the same systematic dedication that had characterized his bank robbery planning, establishing relationships with inmates whose experience and knowledge could contribute to his future criminal enterprises. The prison social structure provided James with advanced training in leadership psychology and organizational management. Success within the inmate hierarchy required the same combination of strategic thinking, tactical flexibility, and calculated use of force that characterized successful criminal organizations on the outside. James quickly established himself as someone who could be trusted to honor agreements, maintain confidentiality, and provide reliable support to allies, while simultaneously demonstrating that betrayal or disrespect would be met with swift and decisive retaliation. During his incarceration, James also gained valuable exposure to criminal enterprises that operated on scales far beyond anything he had previously encountered. Fellow inmates described operations involving multiple cities, complex supply chains, sophisticated money laundering schemes, and organizational structures that resembled legitimate corporations in their complexity and efficiency. These conversations provided blueprints for the kind of criminal empire that James would later construct in Boston, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining strict operational security and limiting exposure to law enforcement infiltration. The controlled substance trade, which was undergoing rapid expansion during the late 1950s and early 1960s, represented a particular area of interest for James during his prison years. Inmates with experience in this field described distribution networks that generated enormous profits while requiring relatively modest initial investments and offering opportunities for rapid expansion into new markets. The key to success, they explained, lay in maintaining strict control over supply chains, carefully selecting reliable distributors, and establishing territorial boundaries that minimized conflict with competing organizations. His release from federal prison in 1965 coincided with significant changes in Boston's criminal landscape that created opportunities for ambitious individuals willing to challenge established power structures. The traditional Italian organized crime families that had long dominated the city's criminal enterprises were facing increased law enforcement pressure and internal conflicts that had weakened their ability to control territory and maintain discipline among their associates. At the same time, the changing demographics of Boston's neighborhoods were creating new markets for illegal goods and services, while traditional sources of legitimate employment were declining or disappearing entirely. The South Boston that welcomed James back after nearly a decade of incarceration was simultaneously familiar and completely transformed. The neighborhood's physical appearance remained largely unchanged. The same triple-decker houses lined the same narrow streets, and the same church spires dominated the skyline, but the social and economic forces shaping daily life had evolved in ways that created both challenges and opportunities for someone with his particular combination of skills and ambitions. The legitimate economy that had supported previous generations of South Boston residents was experiencing a decline that seemed both inevitable and irreversible. The waterfront jobs that had employed James's father and thousands of other local men were disappearing as shipping patterns changed and new technologies reduced the demand for manual labor. Manufacturing employment, which had provided alternative sources of income during economic downturns, was increasingly moving to locations outside the city where land and labor costs were lower and union influence was minimal. These economic pressures created demand for alternative sources of income that operated outside traditional employment structures. Residents who had previously relied on legitimate work were increasingly willing to participate in criminal enterprises that offered more immediate and reliable financial returns. This shift in community attitudes created opportunities for individuals like James, who possessed the organizational skills necessary to coordinate complex criminal operations while maintaining the security required to avoid law enforcement detection. The controlled substance trade was experiencing particularly rapid growth during the mid-1960s, driven by changing social attitudes and expanding consumer demand among demographics that had previously been largely immune to illegal substance use. The traditional distribution networks that had served this market were proving inadequate to meet increased demand while maintaining the operational security necessary to avoid the enhanced law enforcement attention that accompanied market expansion. James quickly recognized that success in this evolving criminal landscape would require a fundamentally different approach than the bank robbery activities that had characterized his earlier career. Rather than focusing on individual high-stakes operations that offered large immediate returns but also carried enormous risks, he began developing a diversified criminal portfolio that included multiple revenue streams with different risk profiles and operational requirements. This approach promised more stable long-term income while also reducing exposure to the kind of law enforcement focus that had led to his previous conviction and incarceration. The extortion schemes that became a central component of his criminal operations during this period reflected both his understanding of local business conditions and his ability to exploit the complex relationship between legitimate enterprises and neighborhood social structures. Local businesses, particularly those owned by individuals who were not deeply embedded in South Boston's social networks, were vulnerable to various forms of pressure that could significantly impact their profitability and long-term viability. James developed methods of applying this pressure that were sufficiently subtle to avoid triggering law enforcement responses while being sufficiently effective to generate reliable revenue streams. The illegal gaming operations that supplemented his other criminal activities capitalized on demand for gambling opportunities that operated outside the heavily regulated and taxed legitimate gaming industry. These enterprises required careful management of both customer relations and law enforcement risk, while also demanding the kind of mathematical sophistication necessary to ensure long-term profitability, regardless of short-term fluctuations in customer luck. James approached these challenges with the same systematic methodology that had characterized his bank robbery planning, creating operations that were both profitable and sustainable over extended periods. As the 1960s drew to a close, James Bulger had successfully completed his transformation from a street-level criminal into an emerging power within Boston's organized crime community. The foundation he had constructed through careful relationship management, strategic thinking, and calculated applications of both cooperation and violence would soon support an expansion of influence that would make him one of the most feared and powerful criminal figures in New England history. The lessons learned through years of struggle, incarceration, and systematic study of criminal methodology had prepared him for challenges that would test every aspect of his intelligence, determination, and ruthlessness in ways that his earlier experiences had only hinted at preparing him to face. The late 1960s marked the beginning of James Bulger's systematic ascension from neighborhood criminal to regional power broker, a transformation that would unfold against the backdrop of Boston's evolving organized crime landscape. His emergence from federal prison had coincided with a period of unprecedented opportunity within New England's criminal underworld, where traditional power structures were fracturing under pressure from law enforcement initiatives, internal conflicts, and changing market dynamics that favored adaptive and ruthless operators over established but inflexible organizations. The Winter Hill Gang, which would become the vehicle for James's rise to criminal prominence, had its origins in the blue-collar neighborhoods of Somerville, just across the Mystic River from Boston. Boston proper. This organization, initially led by James "Buddy" McLean, represented a departure from the traditional Italian-American crime families that had long dominated New England's organized criminal activities. The Winter Hill Gang drew its membership from the Irish-American communities of Greater Boston, creating an alternative power structure that could operate in territories and markets where ethnic loyalties and neighborhood connections provided advantages that transcended traditional criminal hierarchies. James's initial association with Winter Hill began through relationships formed during his incarceration, where he had encountered members of the organization who recognized his potential value as both strategist and enforcer. These early connections provided entry into a criminal network that was both more sophisticated and more ambitious than anything available within the confines of South Boston's traditional crime structure. More importantly, Winter Hill offered opportunities for expansion and influence that would have been impossible to achieve through purely local operations. The organization's operational philosophy aligned perfectly with James's own evolving approach to criminal enterprise. Rather than focusing exclusively on territory-based activities like extortion and illegal gaming, Winter Hill had developed a diversified criminal portfolio that included controlled substance distribution, arms trafficking, illegal gambling operations, and various forms of sophisticated fraud. This diversity provided both financial stability and operational flexibility, allowing the organization to adapt quickly to changing law enforcement priorities and market conditions while maintaining multiple revenue streams that could compensate for temporary disruptions in any single area of activity. Stephen Flemmi, who would become James's most important criminal partner and closest associate, represented the kind of experienced professional criminal that Winter Hill attracted during this period of expansion. Flemmi, a South End native with extensive experience in both violent crime and sophisticated criminal operations, brought to the partnership a combination of tactical expertise and established relationships that complemented James's strategic intelligence and organizational abilities. Their collaboration would prove to be one of the most effective and enduring partnerships in American organized crime history. Flemmi's background included military service during the Korean War, where he had received training in weapons handling, demolitions, and tactical operations that would later prove invaluable in civilian criminal enterprises. His post-military criminal career had included involvement in a wide range of illegal activities, from armed robbery to sophisticated fraud schemes, providing him with the kind of diversified experience that made him an ideal partner for someone with James's ambitious vision of criminal empire building. The partnership between James and Flemmi was formalized during the early 1970s through their joint involvement in Winter Hill operations that required both strategic planning and tactical execution. Their complementary skill sets, James's intelligence and organizational abilities combined with Flemmi's operational experience and violent capabilities, created a leadership team that was uniquely effective in the complex and dangerous environment of Boston organized crime during this period. The territorial expansion that characterized Winter Hill's growth during the early 1970s required careful navigation of existing criminal power structures while simultaneously establishing new sources of revenue and influence. James approached these challenges with the same systematic methodology that had characterized his earlier criminal activities, conducting detailed analysis of potential opportunities and threats while developing contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop as expansion proceeded. The controlled substance trade provided the most immediate opportunities for rapid growth and substantial profit generation. The market for illegal substances was expanding rapidly during this period, driven by changing social attitudes and demographic shifts that were creating demand among consumer groups that had previously been largely immune to such products. Traditional distribution networks, primarily controlled by Italian-American crime families, were proving inadequate to serve this expanding market while maintaining the operational security necessary to avoid enhanced law enforcement attention. James recognized that success in controlled substance distribution would require developing reliable supply chains while simultaneously establishing secure distribution networks that could operate without detection over extended periods. This challenge demanded the same kind of logistical sophistication that characterized legitimate businesses, combined with security measures that far exceeded anything required in conventional commerce. The solution involved creating compartmentalized operational structures where individual participants possessed only limited knowledge of overall organizational activities, reducing the risk that law enforcement penetration of any single component could compromise entire operations. The financial management required to handle the enormous cash flows generated by controlled substance operations, presented additional challenges that demanded innovative solutions. Traditional banking relationships were obviously unavailable for such activities, requiring the development of alternative financial infrastructure that could handle large volumes of currency while maintaining records that would satisfy internal accounting needs without creating evidence that could be used in criminal prosecutions. James's approach to these financial challenges involved creating networks of legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for money laundering operations, while also providing cover for meetings and other organizational activities that would have been difficult to conduct in purely criminal environments. These businesses, ranging from restaurants and bars to cleaning services and construction companies, created a legitimate facade that made it possible to integrate criminal proceeds into the conventional economy while maintaining the appearance of legal business operations. The expansion of Winter Hill's illegal gaming operations during this period reflected both the growing sophistication of the organization and the increasing demand for gambling opportunities that operated outside heavily regulated legitimate venues. These enterprises required careful management of customer relations, operational security, and law enforcement risk, while also demanding mathematical sophistication to ensure long-term profitability, regardless of short-term fluctuations in customer outcomes. James approached illegal gaming with the same systematic analysis that characterized all his criminal enterprises, studying both the mathematical foundations of various gambling activities and the psychological factors that influenced customer behavior. This research informed the development of gaming operations that were carefully calibrated to generate optimal profits while maintaining customer loyalty and minimizing the risk of law enforcement intervention. The enforcement mechanisms that protected Winter Hill operations from both criminal competitors and law enforcement interference represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of the organization's success during this period. James understood that criminal enterprises, unlike legitimate businesses, could not rely on legal remedies to resolve disputes or protect their interests, requiring the development of alternative systems of justice and security that operated entirely outside conventional legal frameworks. The reputation for swift and decisive retaliation against those who threatened Winter Hill interests served as a deterrent that was often more effective than actual violence in maintaining organizational security. James cultivated this reputation through carefully planned responses to challenges that demonstrated both the organization's capability and its willingness to use extreme measures when necessary. These demonstrations were designed to influence the behavior of potential threats while minimizing actual violence and reducing the risk of law enforcement attention that accompanied high-profile criminal activities. The intelligence-gathering operations that supported Winter Hill activities represented another area where James's systematic approach provided significant advantages over less organized criminal competitors. Understanding the activities, intentions, and capabilities of both criminal rivals and law enforcement agencies was essential for making informed strategic decisions and avoiding situations that could threaten organizational survival or individual freedom. James developed networks of informants within various sectors of Boston society, including legitimate businesses, criminal organizations, and government agencies that provided early warning of potential threats while also identifying opportunities for expansion or improvement of existing operations. These intelligence networks required careful management to maintain their effectiveness while protecting their security, demanding the same kind of compartmentalized operational structure that characterized other aspects of Winter Hill activities. The relationship between Winter Hill and traditional Italian-American crime families operating in the Boston area during this period was characterized by a complex mixture of cooperation, competition, and occasional conflict that required careful navigation to avoid escalating into open warfare that would have been destructive for all parties involved. James recognized that direct confrontation with established crime families would be both costly and potentially catastrophic, while complete subordination would limit Winter Hill's growth potential and organizational autonomy. The solution involved developing collaborative relationships in areas where cooperation was mutually beneficial, while maintaining independent operations in markets where Winter Hill possessed competitive advantages. This approach required constant diplomatic effort to maintain the delicate balance between assertion of independence and respect for established territorial boundaries and operational protocols. The elimination of potential threats to Winter Hill's expansion represented one of the most dangerous and controversial aspects of James's rise to power during this period. Criminal organizations that refused to accommodate Winter Hill's growing influence or that actively challenged the organization's operations occasionally required more decisive responses than negotiation or economic pressure could provide. These situations demanded careful analysis to determine whether the benefits of elimination outweighed the risks of increased law enforcement attention and potential retaliation from surviving associates of targeted individuals. The methods employed in these elimination operations reflected James's understanding that success required both operational effectiveness and strategic discretion. Targeted individuals needed to be neutralized in ways that minimized the risk of detection, while simultaneously sending clear messages to other potential threats about the consequences of challenging Winter Hill interests. These requirements demanded careful planning and coordination between trusted associates who possessed both the necessary skills and the discretion to maintain operational security under intense pressure. The recruitment and management of personnel within the expanding Winter Hill organization presented ongoing challenges that required balancing the need for capable and reliable associates with the security risks that accompanied organizational growth. Each new recruit represented both additional capability and potential vulnerability, creating the need for careful screening processes that could identify individuals whose loyalty and competence justified the risks associated with their inclusion in sensitive operations. James developed recruitment criteria that emphasized neighborhood connections and family relationships as indicators of potential loyalty, while also requiring demonstrated competence in relevant criminal activities. New associates were typically introduced to organizational activities gradually, beginning with relatively low-risk assignments that allowed evaluation of their capabilities and reliability before progressing to more sensitive responsibilities that required absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty. The training and indoctrination programs that prepared new Winter Hill associates for their responsibilities within the organization reflected the same systematic approach that characterized all aspects of James's criminal enterprise. New recruits received education in operational security, conflict resolution, financial management, and the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed interactions within Boston's organized crime community. These educational programs also emphasized the importance of maintaining strict discipline and adherence to organizational protocols that had been developed through years of experience and refinement. Associates were taught that survival within the criminal environment required constant vigilance, absolute loyalty to the organization, and willingness to subordinate individual interests to collective security and prosperity. The expansion of Winter Hill's operations beyond Boston's traditional boundaries represented a natural progression of organizational growth that reflected both increasing capability and growing market opportunities in adjacent territories. This geographic expansion required developing relationships with criminal organizations in other cities, while also establishing operational infrastructure that could support activities at greater distances from the organization's traditional power base in the Boston area. James approached territorial expansion with the same careful planning that characterized all his strategic initiatives, conducting detailed reconnaissance of target markets while also analyzing potential opposition and identifying local partners who could facilitate entry into new territories. This expansion strategy emphasized sustainable growth over rapid territorial acquisition, recognizing that premature expansion into areas where Winter Hill lacked adequate resources or relationships could create vulnerabilities that competitors or law enforcement agencies might exploit. The technological innovations that Winter Hill adopted during this period of expansion reflected James's understanding that criminal organizations, like legitimate businesses, needed to embrace new technologies and methods to maintain competitive advantages over less adaptive rivals. Communication systems, surveillance equipment, financial management tools, and transportation methods all evolved during the 1970s in ways that created opportunities for more sophisticated criminal operations. James invested considerable resources in acquiring and learning to use advanced technologies that could provide operational advantages while also training associates in their proper use and maintenance. This technological sophistication became a distinguishing characteristic of Winter Hill operations that contributed significantly to the organization's success in competing with larger and more established criminal enterprises. By the mid-1970s, Winter Hill had evolved from a neighborhood gang into a sophisticated criminal organization that rivaled traditional crime families in terms of both operational capability and territorial influence. James's role within this transformed organization reflected his successful transition from street-level criminal to criminal executive, managing complex operations that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue while employing dozens of associates in various specialized roles. The foundation that James had constructed through patient relationship building, strategic thinking, and systematic organizational development would soon support an even more dramatic expansion of influence that would make Winter Hill one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. The lessons learned during this period of growth and consolidation had prepared him for challenges that would test every aspect of his intelligence, ruthlessness, and political sophistication in ways that would define not only his own legacy, but also the evolution of organized crime in America during the final decades of the 20th century. The stage was now set for the most controversial and ultimately destructive phase of his criminal career, where the relationships and methods that had enabled his rise to power would be tested against federal law enforcement resources and political pressures that would ultimately prove to be beyond even his considerable abilities to manipulate and control. To see the transformation of James Bulger from criminal target to federal asset represents one of the most controversial and ultimately catastrophic examples of law enforcement corruption in American history. This relationship, which would define the peak years of his criminal empire and ultimately contribute to his downfall, began in the mid-1970s through a combination of calculated opportunism, institutional dysfunction, and personal relationships that created conditions for unprecedented criminal activity conducted under the protection of federal law enforcement. The FBI's Boston office during this period was operating under intense pressure to develop intelligence assets within the city's organized crime community, particularly targeting the Italian-American crime families that had long dominated New England's criminal landscape. Federal law enforcement agencies had identified these traditional organizations as priority targets for prosecution under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which provided powerful new tools for dismantling criminal enterprises through coordinated prosecutions of leadership structures and operational networks. John Connolly, the FBI agent who had become James's primary handler and most crucial enabler, embodied both the potential and the dangers inherent in the Bureau's informant development strategy. A South Boston native who had grown up in the same neighborhood as James, Connolly possessed intimate knowledge of local social dynamics and personal relationships that made him uniquely effective at developing and managing criminal informants. His childhood connection to the Bulger family, including a personal relationship with James's younger brother William, who was pursuing a legitimate political career, provided additional leverage and credibility in negotiations with potential assets. Connolly's approach to informant development reflected the FBI's evolving understanding of organized crime as a phenomenon that could best be understood and combated through long-term intelligence gathering rather than reactive responses to individual criminal incidents. This strategic shift required developing relationships with individuals who possessed access to high-level criminal decision-making processes, even if those individuals were themselves actively involved in serious criminal activities that might ordinarily make them targets for prosecution rather than partners in investigation. The initial contact between James and Connolly was facilitated through mutual acquaintances who recognized the potential benefits that such a relationship could provide to both parties. James understood that cooperation with federal law enforcement could provide protection from prosecution, while simultaneously offering opportunities to eliminate criminal competitors through strategic intelligence sharing. Connolly recognized that James's position within Winter Hill and his extensive network of criminal relationships could provide access to intelligence that would be impossible to obtain through conventional investigative methods. The formal establishment of James as a federal informant in 1975 required careful negotiation of terms that would protect both his security and his criminal enterprises, while providing the FBI with intelligence that justified the risks and costs associated with protecting a high-level criminal asset. These negotiations established protocols that would govern their relationship for the next 2 decades, creating a framework for cooperation that prioritized intelligence gathering over law enforcement and criminal prosecution over justice and public safety. The intelligence that James provided during the early years of his relationship with the FBI focused primarily on the activities of Italian-American crime families operating in the Boston area, information that aligned perfectly with federal law enforcement priorities while also serving his own strategic interests in eliminating criminal competitors. This intelligence proved to be both accurate and actionable, leading to successful prosecutions that enhanced the Bureau's reputation while simultaneously weakening criminal organizations that pose threats to Winter Hill's expansion and consolidation. The protection that James received in return for his cooperation extended far beyond simple immunity from prosecution for his own criminal activities. The FBI actively worked to shield him from investigation by other law enforcement agencies, including state and local police departments that might otherwise have pursued cases against Winter Hill operations. This protection included advance warning of planned raids, sharing of intelligence gathered by other agencies, and active interference with investigations that threatened to expose his criminal activities or compromise his position as a federal asset. The elimination of major criminal competitors during this period demonstrated both the effectiveness of James's intelligence sharing and the extent to which federal protection enabled increasingly bold criminal activities. The systematic targeting of rivals through strategic intelligence sharing allowed Winter Hill to expand into territories and markets that would otherwise have been defended by established criminal organizations, while the FBI's protection ensured that these expansion activities proceeded without significant law enforcement interference. The case of the Angulo brothers, who controlled much of Boston's illegal gambling operations and controlled substance distribution through their connections to the Patriarca crime family, exemplified the devastating effectiveness of James's intelligence sharing strategy. Information provided by James enabled the FBI to conduct extensive surveillance operations that resulted in detailed recordings of criminal planning sessions and strategic discussions that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional investigative methods. These recordings, gathered through court-authorized wiretaps installed in the Angulo brothers' headquarters, provided evidence that led to the successful prosecution of the organization's leadership, while simultaneously eliminating Winter Hill's most significant competitors in several lucrative criminal markets. The timing and targeting of these investigations suggested coordination that went far beyond coincidental law enforcement success, indicating the extent to which James's intelligence was being used to reshape Boston's criminal landscape in ways that benefited his own organization. The expansion of Winter Hill's controlled substance operations during this period reflected both the protection provided by federal cooperation and the opportunities created by the elimination of competing organizations. With major rivals either imprisoned or significantly weakened by law enforcement actions, James was able to establish distribution networks that operated with minimal interference from either criminal competitors or law enforcement agencies, generating unprecedented profits while maintaining operational security that would have been impossible without federal protection. The sophistication of these operations exceeded anything previously seen in Boston's criminal community, incorporating advanced communication systems, complex financial management structures, and multi-layered distribution networks that minimized exposure to law enforcement while maximizing efficiency and profitability. This operational sophistication reflected both James's strategic intelligence and the security provided by his federal relationship, which enabled long-term planning and investment that would have been too risky for criminal organizations operating without such protection. The corruption that spread throughout the FBI's Boston office during this period represented one of the most serious institutional failures in the Bureau's history, creating an environment where criminal activity was not only tolerated but actively facilitated by federal agents whose primary loyalty had shifted from law enforcement to asset protection. This corruption extended beyond John Connolly to include supervisory personnel and support staff who were either directly complicit in protecting James or willfully ignorant of activities that clearly violated federal law enforcement guidelines and ethical standards. The financial benefits that flowed to corrupted FBI personnel through their relationship with James included both direct payments for specific services and more subtle forms of compensation that were designed to avoid detection while ensuring continued cooperation. These benefits created personal financial incentives that reinforced the institutional pressures to maintain the informant relationship regardless of its impact on law enforcement effectiveness or public safety, establishing a self-perpetuating system of corruption that became increasingly difficult to identify or eliminate. The intelligence manipulation that characterized this corrupted relationship involved not only the sharing of information that benefited James's criminal activities, but also the suppression or distortion of information that might have threatened his position or exposed the nature of his relationship with federal law enforcement. Reports of Winter Hill criminal activities were routinely minimized minimized or discredited, while intelligence suggesting threats to James's security or criminal operations was prioritized and acted upon with unusual speed and effectiveness. The elimination of potential threats to James's criminal empire during this period included individuals who possessed information about his cooperation with federal law enforcement, those who challenged Winter Hill's territorial expansion, and former associates whose continued existence posed risks to operational security or organizational stability. These eliminations were conducted with a level of planning and operational security that reflected both James's strategic capabilities and the protection provided by his federal relationship. The methods employed in these elimination operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of forensic investigation techniques and law enforcement procedures, suggesting access to information and resources that would typically be available only to law enforcement agencies. Evidence disposal methods, crime scene management, and witness intimidation strategies all reflected knowledge that exceeded what could reasonably be expected from purely criminal sources, indicating the extent to which federal cooperation provided advantages that extended far beyond simple prosecution immunity. The expansion of Winter Hill's extortion operations during this period targeted legitimate businesses throughout the Boston area, creating a systematic taxation system that generated steady revenue while demonstrating the organization's power and reach to both criminal competitors and potential victims. These operations were conducted with minimal concern for law enforcement interference, reflecting confidence in federal protection that enabled increasingly bold and visible criminal activities. The businesses targeted for extortion were carefully selected based on their vulnerability to economic pressure and their limited ability to seek law enforcement protection without risking exposure to regulatory scrutiny or other forms of retaliation. Construction companies, restaurants, bars, and retail establishments were particularly attractive targets because their operations could be easily disrupted through relatively minor interventions, while their owners typically possessed limited political or legal resources for resistance. The collection methods employed in these extortion operations evolved to become increasingly sophisticated and psychologically effective, incorporating detailed intelligence about victims' personal lives, business operations, and family relationships. This personalized approach to intimidation created compliance that was based on genuine fear rather than simple economic calculation, ensuring reliable revenue streams while minimizing the risk of resistance or law enforcement reporting. The political influence that James developed during this period extended beyond his federal law enforcement relationships to include connections within state and local government agencies that provided additional protection for his criminal activities, while also creating opportunities for legitimate business ventures that could serve as fronts for money laundering operations. These political relationships were cultivated through a combination of financial contributions, personal favors, and strategic information sharing that created networks of mutual obligation and dependence. The most significant of these political relationships involved James's younger brother William, whose rising political career provided access to government decision-making processes and advance warning of policy changes or enforcement initiatives that might affect Winter Hill operations. This family connection created opportunities for influence that extended far beyond what could be achieved through purely criminal relationships, while also providing legitimacy and social connections that enhanced James's position within Boston's power structure. The money laundering operations that enabled the integration of Winter Hill's criminal proceeds into the legitimate economy reached unprecedented levels of sophistication during this period, incorporating multiple layers of financial transactions that obscured the original sources of funds while providing seemingly legitimate explanations for the organization's obvious prosperity. These operations required the cooperation of financial institutions, accounting firms, and legal services that were either directly corrupted or willfully ignorant of the obvious criminal origins of the funds they were handling. The legitimate businesses that served as fronts for these money laundering operations were strategically selected to provide credible explanations for large cash transactions while also generating actual profits that could supplement and legitimize criminal income. Restaurants, construction companies, real estate investments, and various service businesses all provided opportunities for financial integration while also creating employment for Winter Hill associates whose criminal records might otherwise limit their legitimate employment opportunities. The intelligence networks that James developed during this period extended throughout Boston's social and economic structure, incorporating informants within legitimate businesses, government agencies, law enforcement organizations, and criminal enterprises that provided comprehensive situational awareness and advance warning of potential threats or opportunities. These networks required careful management to maintain their effectiveness while protecting their security, demanding the same compartmentalized operational structure that characterized other aspects of Winter Hill activities. The information gathered through these networks enabled strategic decision-making that consistently anticipated and avoided law enforcement actions while identifying opportunities for expansion or improvement of existing operations. This intelligence advantage became so significant that Winter Hill operations began to resemble a legitimate intelligence service more than a traditional criminal organization, with information gathering and analysis capabilities that exceeded those of many law enforcement agencies. The training and indoctrination programs that prepared Winter Hill associates for their responsibilities within this expanded organization emphasized the critical importance of operational security and absolute loyalty to organizational interests over personal considerations. Associates were educated about the sophisticated law enforcement techniques being employed against criminal organizations, while also learning methods for avoiding detection and maintaining security under increasingly complex operational conditions. These educational programs also emphasize the unique nature of Winter Hill's federal protection and the careful balance required to maintain relationships that provided unprecedented criminal opportunities while avoiding actions that might trigger federal abandonment or retaliation. Associates learned that their survival and prosperity depended not only on criminal competence but also on political sophistication and strategic understanding that exceeded the requirements of traditional criminal organizations. By the early 1990s, James Bulger had achieved a position of power and influence that was virtually unprecedented in American organized crime history. His criminal empire generated tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue while operating under the active protection of federal law enforcement agencies that had been corrupted into serving as accomplices rather than adversaries. This extraordinary situation enabled criminal activities that were both more extensive and more bold than anything previously seen in American organized crime, while simultaneously creating vulnerabilities that would eventually prove to be catastrophic for all participants in the corrupted relationship. The foundation that James had constructed through patient manipulation of institutional weaknesses and personal relationships had created an empire that seemed invulnerable to conventional law enforcement action. But this apparent strength concealed fundamental contradictions and dependencies that were already beginning to generate the pressures and conflicts that would ultimately bring about its complete destruction. The very success of the devil's bargain that had enabled his rise to unprecedented criminal power was creating conditions that would make his eventual downfall both inevitable and devastating for everyone involved in the corrupted system that had made his empire possible. The beginning of the end for James Bulger's criminal empire came not through traditional law enforcement success, but through the gradual exposure of the institutional corruption that had made his unprecedented criminal career possible. By the early 1990s, the very relationships and protective mechanisms that had enabled his rise to power were becoming liabilities that threatened to destroy not only his criminal organization, but also the federal agents and institutions that had facilitated his activities for nearly 2 decades. The first significant crack in the protective wall surrounding James appeared in 1990, when former FBI agent Robert Fitzpatrick began raising internal concerns about the nature and extent of the Bureau's relationship with its most valuable Boston informant. Fitzpatrick, who had served as assistant special agent in charge of the Boston office, possessed detailed knowledge of informant operations and had observed firsthand the unusual levels of protection and accommodation that were being provided to James, despite mounting evidence of his continued involvement in serious criminal activities. Fitzpatrick's concerns were initially dismissed by FBI leadership, who viewed the intelligence provided by James as too valuable to sacrifice for abstract ethical considerations. However, his persistence in documenting and reporting irregularities began to create internal pressure for review of informant policies and procedures, while also attracting attention from other federal agencies that were less invested in maintaining the existing arrangements. These internal conflicts created the first serious challenges to the protective system that had shielded James from law enforcement action for so many years. The development of competing investigations by agencies outside the FBI's direct control represented a fundamental shift in the law enforcement environment that had previously worked so consistently in James's favor. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and various state and local agencies began developing their own intelligence about Winter Hill activities, creating multiple streams of investigation that could not be controlled or manipulated through the corrupted relationships that had previously provided comprehensive protection. The most serious threat to James's security emerged through federal investigations that focused not on his own criminal activities, but on the corruption of FBI personnel who had facilitated his operations. These investigations, conducted by the FBI's own Internal Affairs Department and by federal prosecutors who had not been compromised by the Boston office's corrupt relationships, began uncovering evidence of systematic violations of federal law enforcement guidelines and criminal statutes by agents who had prioritized asset protection over law enforcement responsibilities. John Connolly, James's primary FBI handler, became the focus of intense scrutiny as investigators began documenting the extent of his personal relationship with his most valuable informant. Financial records, surveillance reports, and testimony from other FBI personnel created a detailed picture of corruption that extended far beyond acceptable informant management practices into active criminal conspiracy. These investigations revealed that Connolly had received substantial financial benefits from his relationship with James, while simultaneously providing protection and assistance that facilitated serious criminal activities. The evidence gathered against Connolly included documentation of unauthorized meetings, unreported financial transactions, and active interference with investigations conducted by other law enforcement agencies. More damaging still were recordings and testimony that demonstrated his advance warning of planned law enforcement actions, sharing of sensitive intelligence gathered by federal agencies, and participation in strategy sessions that were designed to protect James's criminal operations rather than gather intelligence about organized crime activities. The federal grand jury investigations that began in 1994 represented the culmination of years of mounting pressure and internal conflict within federal law enforcement agencies. These investigations possessed subpoena power and prosecutorial authority that could not be deflected through the personal relationships and institutional corruption that had previously protected James from serious legal jeopardy. More importantly, they were conducted by prosecutors and investigators who had not been compromised by the Boston FBI office's corrupted culture and who possessed both the resources and the institutional support necessary to pursue cases wherever the evidence led. James's decision to flee federal prosecution in January 1995 was precipitated by advance warning that indictments were imminent and that the protective relationships that had shielded him for 2 decades could no longer guarantee his freedom. This warning, provided through the same corrupted FBI relationships that had previously enabled his criminal activities, gave him crucial time to arrange his disappearance, while federal authorities were still preparing their cases and coordinating arrest operations. The escape preparations that James had developed over many years reflected both his strategic intelligence and his realistic understanding of the eventual limits of federal protection. Financial resources had been systematically accumulated and placed in secure locations that could be accessed without creating investigative trails, while false identification documents and alternative personas had been prepared for use in emergency situations. These preparations enabled a disappearance that was both rapid and comprehensive, leaving few traces that could be used to track his movements or predict his destinations. Catherine Gregg, James's longtime companion, accompanied him into fugitive life despite the enormous personal costs and risks associated with abandoning her established life to support someone who had become one of America's most wanted criminals. Her decision to join him reflected both personal loyalty and an understanding that her own knowledge of his activities and relationships made her a potential target for federal prosecution if she remained behind. Their partnership in fugitive life would prove to be both a source of mutual support and ultimately a vulnerability that contributed to their eventual capture. The initial phase of their fugitive existence involved extensive travel throughout the United States as they searched for a location that could provide both security and anonymity while maintaining access to the financial resources necessary to sustain their lifestyle. This search required careful evaluation of local law enforcement capabilities, community social dynamics, and geographical factors that might influence their ability to maintain false identities over extended periods. The challenges of fugitive life quickly became apparent as they struggled to balance security requirements with basic human needs for stability and social connection. The federal manhunt that followed James's disappearance represented one of the most intensive and sustained fugitive investigations in American law enforcement history. The FBI, working to redeem its reputation after the corruption scandals that had enabled his escape, devoted enormous resources activities to tracking his movements and identifying potential hiding places. This investigation incorporated advanced forensic techniques, international cooperation agreements, and public awareness campaigns that generated thousands of tips and leads from citizens throughout the world. The psychological profile that federal investigators developed to guide their manhunt incorporated detailed analysis of James's personality, preferences, and behavioral patterns based on decades of surveillance and informant reporting. This profile suggested that he would gravitate toward environments that provided both anonymity and cultural familiarity, likely choosing locations with significant Irish-American populations or historical connections to his background. The profile also predicted that his need for control and information would drive him to maintain some level of contact with associates or family members, creating potential opportunities for surveillance and detection. The technology available to federal investigators during the 1990s and 2000s provided unprecedented capabilities for tracking fugitives and analyzing communication patterns, financial transactions, and movement data that might reveal concealed identities or locations. Advanced computer systems could process enormous volumes of information to identify patterns and anomalies that might indicate fugitive activity, while improved communication networks enabled rapid coordination of investigative activities across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Despite these technological advantages, James's careful preparation and disciplined adherence to security protocols enabled him to avoid detection for more than 16 years, demonstrating both his strategic intelligence and his realistic understanding of law enforcement capabilities and limitations. His fugitive lifestyle involved systematic avoidance of activities and behaviors that might create investigative opportunities, while maintaining the flexible financial resources and alternative identities necessary to relocate quickly if security was compromised. The Santa Monica apartment where James and Catherine eventually established their longest period of residence provided an ideal environment for extended concealment within an urban setting that offered both anonymity and access to necessary services. Their chosen identities as retired Charles and Carol Gasco enabled them to interact with neighbors and service providers without generating suspicion, while their careful management of financial transactions and communication activities avoided creating the digital footprints that might have revealed their true identities. The lifestyle that they maintained during their years in Santa Monica reflected both the constraints of fugitive existence and James's continued need for control and information about developments that might affect their security. They established routines that provided stability and normalcy while maintaining the flexibility necessary to disappear rapidly if circumstances required relocation. Their relationship with neighbors and local businesses was carefully calibrated to avoid both isolation that might generate suspicion and excessive familiarity that might compromise their assumed identities. The breakthrough in the federal investigation that led to their eventual capture came through enhanced analysis of old tips and leads that had been generated during the early years of the manhunt. Advanced data processing capabilities available in 2011 enabled investigators to identify patterns and connections in previously analyzed information that suggested potential locations and identities that merited renewed attention. This technological analysis, combined with persistent investigative work by agents who had maintained focus on the case throughout the fugitive period, created new opportunities for surveillance and verification activities. The FBI's decision to launch a targeted publicity campaign focusing on Catherine Greig represented a strategic shift in investigative approach that acknowledged both the limitations of traditional fugitive hunting methods and the potential vulnerabilities created by their long-term partnership. This campaign, which featured enhanced publicity about Catherine's background, appearance, and likely activities, generated renewed public attention and resulted in tips that proved crucial to their eventual identification and location. The arrest of James and Catherine in Santa Monica on June 22, 2011, ended one of the longest and most intensive manhunts in American criminal history. The operation involved careful coordination between multiple federal agencies and local law enforcement organizations to ensure that both fugitives were apprehended without violence or opportunity for escape. The discovery of substantial financial resources, multiple firearms, and false identification documents in their apartment confirmed the extent of their preparation for fugitive life, while also providing evidence of continued criminal activities during their years of concealment. The legal proceedings that followed James's arrest involved complex negotiations between federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and representatives of victims' families who had waited decades for opportunities to confront the man responsible for so much violence and suffering in their communities. These proceedings were complicated by the need to address not only James's own criminal activities, but also the federal corruption that had enabled his crimes and prolonged his freedom from prosecution. The decision by federal prosecutors to seek life imprisonment rather than the death penalty reflected both practical considerations about the strength of available evidence and strategic calculations about the most effective methods for achieving justice in cases involving such extensive criminal activity and institutional corruption. This prosecutorial approach enabled plea negotiations that resulted in James's agreement to provide information about unsolved cases while accepting responsibility for a pattern of criminal activity that spanned more than 4 decades. The trial proceedings that concluded with James's conviction on multiple charges of racketeering, money laundering, extortion, and conspiracy provided unprecedented public exposure of the extent of his criminal activities and the institutional failures that had enabled his career. Testimony from former associates, victims' family members, and law enforcement officials created a comprehensive record of criminal activity that helped explain both the scope of his influence and the lasting damage inflicted on individuals, families, and communities throughout New England. The sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole that James received reflected both the severity of his crimes and the need for symbolic justice that acknowledged the suffering of his many victims. This sentence ensured that he would spend his remaining years in the federal prison system removed from the community that he had terrorized, while also separated from the network of relationships and resources that had sustained his criminal career for so many decades. The transfer to the United States Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia in October 2018 placed James in a maximum security environment that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. This facility, known for its harsh conditions and history of violence, represented the final destination for someone whose criminal career had been characterized by the strategic use of violence and intimidation against others who could not defend themselves effectively. The circumstances surrounding James's death on October 30th, 2018, less than 12 hours after his arrival at Hazleton, reflected the same culture of violence that had defined his entire criminal career. The brutal nature of his elimination by fellow inmates suggested that his reputation and the nature of his crimes had preceded him into the prison environment, where the same principles of power and retaliation that had governed his outside activities continued to operate according to their own harsh logic. The investigation into his prison death revealed security failures and systemic problems within the federal prison system that paralleled the institutional weaknesses that had enabled his criminal career decades earlier. The failure to provide adequate protection for a high-profile inmate whose cooperation with federal authorities had made him a target for retaliation demonstrated continuing problems within institutions responsible for maintaining justice and public safety. The legacy of James Bulger's criminal career extends far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on his direct victims to include fundamental changes in federal law enforcement policies, informant management procedures, and institutional oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that enabled his activities. The scandals surrounding his relationship with the FBI resulted in congressional investigations, policy reforms, and prosecutions of federal agents that continue to influence law enforcement practices throughout the United States. The impact on Boston's Irish-American community, particularly in South Boston, created lasting divisions and traumatic memories that continue to influence neighborhood dynamics and relationships with law enforcement agencies. The revelation that someone who had been viewed by many as a neighborhood protector was actually a federal informant who had betrayed associates and community members while enriching himself through violence and intimidation shattered fundamental assumptions about loyalty, justice, and community solidarity. The financial costs associated with James's criminal career, including investigation expenses, prosecution costs, victim compensation, and institutional reforms reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars, while the human costs of his activities continue to affect families and communities whose lives were forever changed by his actions. These costs represent not only the direct damage inflicted by his criminal activities, but also the broader social impact of institutional corruption and the breakdown of trust between communities and the government agencies responsible for protecting them. The lessons learned from James Bulger's criminal career continue to influence discussions about the appropriate balance between law enforcement effectiveness and ethical constraints, the dangers of institutional corruption, and the importance of oversight mechanisms that can identify and address systemic problems before they create opportunities for the kind of extensive criminal activity that characterized his unprecedented career of violence and manipulation. The story of James Whitey Bulger serves as a stark reminder that the greatest threats to justice and public safety sometimes emerge not from the obvious failures of criminal behavior, but from the subtle corruption of the institutions and relationships that are supposed to protect society from such predators. His legacy stands as a testament to the devastating consequences that can result when the guardians of justice become accomplices to the very crimes they are sworn to prevent and prosecute. This concludes our examination of one of American history's most notorious criminal figures, whose life and career illuminate the darkest corners of organized crime and institutional corruption. For more deep dives into the cases that have shaped our understanding of crime and justice, remember to subscribe to Sleep Crime, where we explore the stories that reveal the complex realities behind the headlines and the lasting impact of choices that echo through generations.